Right, now let's turn our attention now to something completely different, back on shore, back on land. And, well, the argument that we are constantly being told that we live in a horrible country, white privilege, horrible racism, we have a brutal, horrific, shameful, imperialistic past, and Britain has been a force for evil and not for good, not just now, but in the past and, hey, probably in the future as well. That's the message we're often getting about this country, and it's not one that I think sits well with most people in this country, whatever your ethnicity or heritage or background. Well, one man has decided to write about this, and his name is Dr. Rakib Ehsan. You're a regular here on the show. He's a social policy analyst and writer, and he's got a brand new book out called Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Minorities. And I'm delighted to welcome Rakib to the show. Good morning to you.
Morning, Julia. How are you?
Very well indeed. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's a fascinating book. And again, I mean, you will be upsetting all of the right or maybe the wrong people, I don't know, by daring to say, maybe Britain isn't so awful after all, and maybe not everybody who happens to have a darker shade of skin than me, which is pretty much everyone, with my Irish heritage, that don't think that this is a terrible place to live. But I don't think you're allowed to say that anymore, Rakib.
Well, if we're not allowed to say that, then I've definitely shattered some sensible liberal norms, so-called sensible liberal norms. I think that the big part of the book for me, Julia, was to tackle those grossly inaccurate caricatures of Britain when it comes to its record on matters of race and equality. And I also feel that quite often traditional and patriotic ethnic minorities are severely underrepresented, in fact, when it comes to voices in the mainstream liberal media. Yeah. I've made the point that for all its flaws, the UK has made significant progress when it comes to matters of racial equality in recent times. But a really important point that I make in the book is that ethnic minorities feel that compared to their ethnic minority counterparts in other countries in the Western world, whether that's in the USA or when you look at EU member states such as France, Germany and the Netherlands, they feel that the freedoms, protections and opportunities provided in Britain are of a far wider and larger scale.
And indeed, I mean, we know, race relations, I mean, things like interethnic marriage and things are far greater in this country and a very different relationship. Certainly, we often, I think, import American race relations, which has such a different basis. We never had to have a battle for civil rights for people of colour in this country. We didn't have, although yes, we were involved in the slave trade. So was every empire in the world ever. But we were instrumental in closing down certainly the transatlantic slave trade. But people living in Britain of colour were not the descendants of people brought here by slavery. And that makes for a very different background to the debate, doesn't it? One of the things I find fascinating is, and this comes across, I think, in American politics as well as British politics, this idea that even when people of colour do well, and by the way, let's look at some of the great offices of state being held, for goodness sake. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the former Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, all people of colour, which no one who's got a normal life and isn't obsessed with race baiting blinks an eye at. I mean, OK, yeah, someone in the BNP might not like it, and someone who's a race baiter might want to discuss it. Everyone else just goes, are they any good at their job? They couldn't care less about it. But even when people of colour do make it into these top jobs, which apparently are impossible for them to achieve because we are a racist society, they're told they're the wrong kind of black person, the wrong kind of Asian. Horrible racist slurs like coconut are used about them by so-called right-on anti-racist liberals.
No, absolutely. And I think that one particular episode that springs to mind is when Rupert Huck referred to Kwasi Kwarteng as superficially black. Just because of his speaking style and the fact that his educational background, which I thought was absolutely remarkable. I think we need to really get away from that toxic racial identity politics. It certainly doesn't improve the quality of our multiracial democracy. But I think the really important point that you make, Julia, is that Britain is not America. Yeah. America, compared to us, is a relatively youthful nation. I think it's still really struggling to get to grips with the legacy of slavery and segregation as recently as the 1960s. And I think many people who are not too familiar with the story of Bamber Bridge I think that actually tells you how far advanced the UK was and British people were in terms of their anti-racist attitudes compared to what was going on across the pond, especially when it comes to segregation.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't say that I look at the country through rose-tinted spectacles. I still think there's improvements to be made.
Of course there
in the labour market to healthcare and policing. I think that the Windrush scandal, considering it's going to be the 75-year anniversary this week, I think there's done untold damage to institutional trust in a number of Black Caribbean communities. But I think that there's one country that I trust to actually improve and strengthen its record on race relations. It would be this one.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is fascinating. There's been so much discussion about, what people think of this country. This assumption that's often made that, and this is just a racist assumption, that all people of one particular skin colour think the same way. And that obviously isn't the case. The same way that all white people or all men or women don't think the same way. People come with individual political attitudes. And I find myself sometimes using this awful phrase, the black community, the Asian community. There isn't a community. There's no white community. So why do we think anything different? But also, particularly on the Liberal left, this expectation that if you are black or Asian, that you must vote Labour, you must sign up to all this grievance politics, and that you have these sort of liberal attitudes, say, to things like immigration. Whereas actually the polling suggests, I would say, quite the opposite. Actually, many families with Asian heritage in particular, many have families with West African heritage and Afro-Caribbean heritage, actually, with strong religious views, whether it's Christianity or any other religion, actually often have a very conservative with a small v, saucy attitude to things like the family unit, and also concerns about things like unlimited immigration, because of course many of those will be first or second generation immigrants who are most likely to feel the impact of a larger immigrant community competing for jobs and housing.
No, absolutely. And there's a chapter in the book that's in defence of the family, and another chapter, the power of faith. And I think that was the argument that I'm trying to make, that the left has to re-engage with its traditional values, especially when it comes to the importance of the family unit, and also how faith can be a source of optimism and resilience, especially in challenging times. And I think that if it speaks that more traditional-minded language, I think that would help Labour, especially the Liberal left, reconnect with traditional ethnic minorities who maybe in recent times have given the Conservatives much of a hearing. Mind you, I think when it comes to cultural conservatism, I don't think that we have. I think we have a Conservative Party which is conservative in name only. Yeah. If truth be told, but I think you make a really important point that many ethnic minorities, they don't see themselves as victims as their own country. They have entrepreneurial values. They prioritise self-sufficiency. I think they really value the educational opportunities in this country. I think that was one of the main motivations behind my parents of Bangladeshi origin moving to this country. The fact that we do have a highly respected educational system. I don't know why we still do, but for some reason we do. Yeah, but we also know that many minority ethnic groups in this country do an awful lot better than, say, particularly the group that really is at the bottom of the pile is white working class boys. Absolutely. And I think that's something I challenged in the book, that this US-style intersectionality, which sees the white male as the epitome advantage. Yeah. When you look at educational outcomes, that's really not the case. White working class boys are lagging considerably behind many of their peers in ethnic minority groups. And you'll see whether it's educational outcomes or employment, there's ethnic minority communities, especially those of Chinese and Indian origin, who have very strong family units. There's also a very strong emphasis on sort of self-discipline, routine, and all the rest of it. They're performing particularly well. And I make the point in the book that ultimately one of the greatest advantages you can have in life is having a stable and attentive family life. Just going to say, this has all got more to do with culture and family, attitudes to education, having two parents in the home who care about you and are there every day. That matters far more as an indication for success in life. But also, again, I think the main thing that I got out of this book, beyond grievance, like, let's move on from this. Things were not great. Things are getting better. It's not the 1950s. It's certainly not the 1850s still in terms of attitudes. And if everybody, if we start treating people as individuals with all their failures and all their successes, rather than, you should say, you must have this view, you must be like this because you look like that, and I must be like this because I look like that, that we will move on. I mean, it is terrifying that this division has been brought back to our politics. And I think that's something that I really tackle in the book, that this brainless importation of racial identity politics from the US, a totally different national context. It won't serve our society as well at all when it comes to making progress on matters of equality. And I think that we need to return to the bread and butter of family duties, personal responsibility and individual initiative, which many people see as old-fashioned.
Yeah, never catch on, Rakib, never catch on. We'll have to leave that there. Dr. Rakib Ehsan, your brand new book, Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Minorities. Thank you so much. 9:48 is the time. This is